Welcome to this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series. We're traveling the country, touring the modern railroad empires of America's most talented modelers, and giving you a chance to hear their insight and modeling know-how firsthand. From incredible lifelike scenery to the remarkably detailed structures and rolling stock, get ready for new inspiration for your dream layout. Now settle in and enjoy your behind-the-scenes tour of America's top model railroads in this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series.
Hi, and welcome to the Muscle Shell and Yogo Peak Railroad, or MNYP for short. I'm Doug Hodgdon, and the MNYP was a vision of myself and Bill Briggs. I started in model railroading when I was 3 years old with the gift of a wind-up train for Christmas. I grew up in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and at the time, St. Louis Park was an industrial suburb of Minneapolis with lots of railroad activity. I was lucky enough to have a neighbor who was a freight conductor on the local Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern Railroad, and I rode with him in his caboose quite often, learning how a real short-line railroad operated. I also had great modeling inspiration while quite young. A neighbor, Gene Hickey, had an absolutely fascinating 8-show layout in his basement. He had the artistic gift of bringing a model scene to life and even went on to become president of the NMRA. After absorbing Gene's layout, I put an ad in the paper for my American Flyer trains and went into the exciting scale world of HO modeling. Eventually, my modeling hobby turned into a profession, and for many decades now, I've had my own model railroad construction business. Bill was one of my business's best clients. Sadly, Bill passed away in the spring of 2009 and isn't here today to talk about his life's passion, this model railroad. However, as someone who was there from the beginning of the bench work to the completion of the scenery, I'm happy to share these stories behind this great layout with you. The theme of the layout is Montana in the 1960s era and is comprised of 4 intertwining and interconnecting mainline railroads: the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, the Burlington, and Bill's own freelance road, the Muscle Shell and Yogo Peak. The scenery is composed of real rocks, many actually from Montana. Also concrete, hard shell plaster, ground foam, and lots of natural materials. We believe the Muscle Shell and Yogo Peak is the heaviest layout in town. It's been a real joy to have seen it evolve to its current state. Today we are going to tour the MNYP, so let's get started. Bill loved Western history, and his favorite place to visit was Montana. He was a city kid that loved the Wild West. He built a summer home in the area and became more interested in Montana rail lines. When we started the layout, Bill had a few criteria for his model railroad. He wanted to include all his favorite Montana lines, including the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, and the Burlington. He wanted to be able to run long trains, which meant we needed wide curves on double-ended staging that could handle trains over 40 cars in length. And he also wanted it to be freelanced. We freelanced the towns using prototypical locations as inspiration for mountain scenes, remote locations, ghost towns, and so on. We wanted to capture the essence of these towns, including mountain life, ramshackle structures, and the junk piles that seem to pop up everywhere. We also created a freelanced railroad line for the layout, the actual Muscle Shell and Yogo Peak. It was created based on names of locations near Bill's mountain home in Montana, the Muscle Shell River and the Yogo Peak in the Rocky Mountains. We used books to find railroad locations that we wanted to visit. And when we returned from a trip, we always came back with more ideas than we could possibly have time to implement. The Eagle Nest Tunnel and our own John Allen Loop are 2 examples of this. Western culture is very different from the life we live here in the Midwest, and traveling to these real railroad locations really helped us capture the essence of life in the West. One great thing about traveling is that it enabled us to collect natural materials during our visits. There are rocks and gravel everywhere out west, and we use these natural materials that we collected on the layout. So we brought a real piece of Montana back to the layout. Those of us who are passionate about trains know that it's not just about trains, it's also about the camaraderie. And Bill wanted the railroad to be a place where people could gather. He used this open aisle configuration to allow for socialization while operators were running trains. The layout you see here today has gone through many transformations throughout the years. The real beginnings of the MNYP began in Edina, Minnesota decades ago when Bill and I first started working together. Sections of the MNYP are now in their third home. Yep, that's right, we moved the layout not once, but twice. And every time the layout moved, the layout got bigger and heavier. And remember that we build with real rocks and concrete. After the layout sections were moved to this final location, hydraulic jacks were needed to raise the sections to the correct height. It was quite a challenge to move and rebuild such a layout, but it gave us opportunities to improve the layout by adding new features. We widened the curves and created longer sections of tangent track, which is very prototypical and shows off a long train well. The layout has evolved over the past 20 years, and even though it looks complete, there is more detailing and modeling work to be done. There will always be another project on the horizon. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of our main lines. Our tour along the rail lines of the MNYP starts at the east end of the layout in Pine Canyon. Pine Canyon is actually a location along the route. However, this scenic canyon is a gateway to the layout for the Milwaukee Road. Pine Canyon actually begins outside of the layout room with the interchange yard at Caiston. Caiston is actually the 19-foot railroad display case in the railroad lounge. It has 3 levels of active track running through it. The wall openings between the 2 rooms were constructed when the home was being built so that the trains could pass through. The lower level is the joint MNYP, Montana Southwestern, and Burlington track, which leads into East Canyon Springs. The mid-level is the Milwaukee Road, which leads to Pine Canyon. Both these levels have passing sidings and lead into the multi-level staging. The uppermost level of the operating tracks leads to the MNYP Lilo branch and runs upgrade through the case on its way to Briggsdale. Here we encounter the first of the 4 railroads on the layout, the Milwaukee Road. Our train today is a Milwaukee passenger local pulled by F unit number 85C. The train travels out of the staging yard at Caiston and through the wall on its way to Pine Canyon. Our train emerges into Pine Canyon on the other side of the wall. Above the Milwaukee line on top of the hill is Litfin Log Camp number 1. It's named after one of our model railroad friends, as are many establishments along our tour. Jack Litfin is really in the lumber business. The Litfin Log Camp is accessed by a 96-foot log truss bridge that was scratch-built using real local timber from Bill's backyard. Behind the bridge is the painted backdrop. The entire backdrop for the layout was painted by a local artist and retired art teacher, Andy Ostazeski. His work adds tremendous realism and depth to the scenes we will see along our tour today. As our train continues through the canyon, we pass a large rock outcropping that is actually a real rock, and a small hobo camp. Bill loved to create scenes such as this pond scene located here on the edge of the canyon. Notice the fishermen and the cabin scene. Engine number 85C rounds the curve heading out of Pine Canyon. Moving down to the valley, we arrive in East Canyon Springs. East Canyon Springs is a typical railroad town. It's gone through many transitions through its existence on Bill's layout. Here we will pick up a Montana Southwestern / MNYP freight train powered by Montana Southwestern F unit number 106. The freight train enters the layout through the Burlington Tunnel number 1. Burlington Tunnel number 1 is a ventilated concrete tunnel. We added the open roll-up door and vent on top of the tunnel for authenticity. Engine 106 continues down the line, passing through the industrial area of East Canyon Springs. The town of East Canyon Springs has many great craftsman structures, as does the rest of the layout. Bill has done lots of real estate upgrading over the years. These highly detailed buildings are primarily made from kits. Each building is unique, adding interest to the town. The Sokol Mattress and Furniture Company provides an excellent view block, preventing the viewer from seeing the whole viaduct in the background. We love all of these great buildings. There are even structures that are more than 50 years old on this layout, like these two, the Dish Building Supply and Braxton Company, built by Gene Hickey, a former local modeler and NMRA president who became well known for his craftsman structures. The road was made out of foam core, painted and weathered. We added realistic details like sand, weeds, and brush. East Canyon Springs was packed with lots of mini scenes. We've used trees in the foreground around the layout to add a view block. We also wanted to break up the scenes rather than using building after building. To do that, we added a small stream between the buildings here. Further east are the Montana Southwestern Yards. A fire took the diesel shop. Note the remains. The Montana Southwestern wasn't part of the original layout. However, the MSW assets were merged with Bill's MNYP after the sudden death of another great member of our group, Tom Satira. Above the town of East Canyon Springs is the east end of the Milwaukee Upper Canyon Springs passing sighting. The impressive 526-foot double-track steel viaduct over the Burlington line was scratch-built using aluminum channel for structure, micro-engineering, and Central Valley parts, and is the longest double-track bridge on the layout. It had to be built in place and took over 100 hours to build. To the rear of the town, behind the bridge, flows the Judith River, whose source is high up in the Little Belt Mountains behind Canyon Springs. Judith River was named after Bill's wife, Judy. It is one of the many ways Bill personalized his railroad. The river was made from poured epoxy resin. As we head out of East Canyon Springs, we pass Seafield Scrap and Fry Coal and Oil, both named for friends of Bill's. The next town on the line is Canyon Springs. Canyon Springs is the major hub city of the layout. It's one of the original sections of the layout, now in its third home. Canyon Springs hosts all four of Bill's mainline railroads and the local Canyon Springs trolley line. Our Montana Southwestern engine number 106 heads toward the Canyon Springs depot. The depot is a Walther's kit and has interior lighting. We detail both the interior and exterior of the depot. On display next to the depot is MNYP 440 number 1. It was a pioneer on the railroad, but its working days have long since been over. Behind the depot is the business district, including the Canyon Springs Hotel. There was always a hotel across from the depot in the old days. B&H Rail Tours office is located in town. We used to take lots of friends on rail tours around the country, and this was the inspiration for the fictitious organization and this building. And the Carriage Theater. The Carriage Theater is another example of Bill incorporating his friends and family into the railroad. The Carriages were friends of Bill's, and they really owned a theater. Notice the chasing theater lights. They were individually installed LEDs. Looks like it's a full house at the theater tonight. We used lights throughout the layout, including street lights, signals, and interior building lights. These traffic lights run off of the track power. Another trick we used to extend the scene and add depth was adding a mirror at the back of the tunnel. We also added a trolley line in Canyon Springs for scenic effect. It's a unique feature, although it doesn't actually operate. Behind downtown Canyon Springs is Upper Canyon Springs. This is the Milwaukee Road section of town. The Milwaukee arrives over the 180-foot double-track concrete viaduct, which is Milwaukee Bridge number 2, and crosses over the NP double track and the Canyon Springs trolley line. The commercial row includes the Bob Weiser Brewery, named after another of Bill's friends. They even have their own fleet of refrigerator cars. We had custom decals created for these cars. Next to the brewery is the retail location of the Lilo Lumber Company. Both locations have railroad spurs for regular deliveries. The Milwaukee Road Depot facilities are in the Gallatin Inn Hotel. The real Gallatin Inn Hotel was on a Milwaukee Road branch line leading to Yellowstone National Park. The orange limo in front of the hotel is authentic. It's the same type of vehicle that was used to transport guests to the park. There is also a waiting platform across the tracks from the hotel at the west end of the long Milwaukee passing siding. Montana Power is at the west end of Upper Canyon Springs. It's responsible for supplying power to the city of Canyon Springs and has a spur as well. Back at the Canyon Springs Depot, a westbound Northern Pacific North Coast Limited is about ready to leave. 3 F units power the train, led by number 6701A. After a scheduled crew change, the Northern Pacific North Coast Limited rolls out of the station. Further to the west is the very exclusive Canyon Club with its private varnish spur. A Milwaukee business car is spotted there now. 2 of the requirements for membership are to have lots of money and own a private railroad car. Rumors circulate about the town over what really goes on behind those restricted doors. Engine number 6701A passes by the club on its way to West Canyon Springs. West Canyon Springs is the last urban area on the layout. It was one of the last towns added to the layout and is built into the hillside. Here the Northern Pacific North Coast Limited begins its westbound upgrade ascent. When building this area of the layout, we worked from back to front to prevent damaging the scenery. In the foreground of West Canyon Springs is a gravel road and some rundown commercial buildings. These are also craftsman buildings. There are a lot of little details that really make the scenes come to life, including the mailman, a stocked seafood truck, and a store window display ready for customers. The West Canyon Springs town site winds uphill to the rear. We made the scenery before we placed the buildings. We didn't want the foundations to be level because that's not always how it is in the real world. Placing the buildings last allowed us to mold the foundations into the hillside. This is the first residential area on the layout. The Milwaukee Road is squeezed between the town of West Canyon Springs and the rock wall to the rear. You hardly know it's there. That's intentional for scenic effect. There's a small 38-foot culvert bridge back there, and we added this culvert as another scene break to break up the buildings. When planning this area, we quickly realized we weren't going to have enough space for 3 railroad lines and all the scenic details we wanted to incorporate. To save space, we put the branch line viaduct over the road here. We think it adds character to the area. Located at the far west end of town are the MNYP yards and shops. This is the outskirts of Canyon Springs and includes restaurants, more rundown structures, and other miscellaneous details. Here again we used uneven scenery, first creating the scenery and then building the structures into it. Here we find the MNYP sheds, yards, engine house, an 82-foot turntable, and the railroad offices. Big decisions are made here. There are lots of mini scenes in this area. Junk makes a scene. Notice the casket and headstone shop and the guys fixing the sewer line. Bill's love of trees definitely shows in this area. There is just about every type of tree here, including commercial and scratch-built trees. Continuing its climb upgrade, the NP train heads toward the double-track concrete tunnel. And alongside, at a slightly higher elevation, is the MNYP Tunnel Number 2, constructed of cut stone. Plunging into the darkness of the tunnel, the North Coast Limited is on its way toward 2 Dot. Heading into more rugged country, we continue further west to the 2 Dot area. There are 3 towns in this area: Bill, 2 Dot, and Lombard. At the front of the layout, we see Bill and Judy's J. Barbie Ranch site at Bill, Montana. There is also a small town site nearby. In the foreground is the spur to the J. Barbie Ranch with its grain elevator and stock pens. There is also a spur here for Bill to park his private rail car, the Montana, while visiting the ranch. Notice the figures taking in the scenery at the back of the rail car. The ranch complex itself is in the valley. We cut a road into the hillside for access to the ranch complex. The ranch house was actually used as a photo on a Christmas card from the Briggs. We used chalk to weather all the buildings. There are a lot of interesting scenes around the complex, including this slide, which leads into a pond, the family's private cemetery, and lots of horses. Bill had a hard time finding these horse trailers in HO scale, but he finally found them in Florida. Over on the hilltop is the commercial area that includes a scrap dealer with lots of great items for sale, the Bill store, whose sign was modeled after an actual sign we saw in Bill, Wyoming, the railway saloon, complete with its own motorcycle gang, Judy's store, and a boarding house. The boarding house was the last structure built for Bill. It was built by Bill Bradford of Florida, who built many structures for Bill. Notice the guys walking down the hill. Looks like they had a good time tonight, huh? Above Bill is 2 Dot. 2 Dot was developed as a mining and railroad junction town at the base of some extreme mountain terrain. The town itself is another one that's in its 3rd home now. 2 Dot is an actual place along the old Milwaukee Road in Montana that Bill and I visited. Our train continues under a shared triple track through girder bridge crossing the NP double track. Two Dot is also served by a flag stop station on the NP. Although the NP doesn't have a depot located here, there is an outhouse behind flag stop station. Very thoughtful of the Northern Pacific. The MNYP has a depot facility at 2 Dot. You'll notice that the Lombard branch is dual gauge. The narrow gauge mining days are about over, but the MNYP still rosters 2 narrow gauge 2-truck shays, primarily for its tourist business, and look at that! The tourist train is about ready to leave the depot. The Lombard smelter is to the rear and is served by both narrow gauge and standard gauge rails. 2 Dot has a sizable commercial area and includes the State Bank of 2 Dot and the Territorial Enterprise newspaper, run by none other than Lucius M. Beebe, the famous railroad author. There is also a post office in town. This is one of the original sections of the layout, decades old now. It's pretty amazing when a model railroad becomes a piece of history. Behind 2 Dot, at the highest point in this area, is Lombard. Lombard is another mining area and is served by the standard gauge leg of the MNYP Lombard branch. The Lombard mine and associated structures are here, including a 2.5-foot gauge mine tram. This too is one of the original sections of the layout. Southwest of the mine is Mirror Lake, and above the lake is Bill and Judy's log home and mountain retreat. Of course, there is a private railroad platform close by for their convenience. Our train leaves the flag stop station in 2 Dot, passes under the road bridge, and rounds the corner on its way to the short tunnel. Palisade is our next stop on the line. This too is a location on the line, not an actual town. Palisade is a geographically unique area with a huge, nearly vertical rock face. Passing through the NP short tunnel, we enter into the Palisade area. This near vertical rock face presented quite an engineering problem for the railroads that needed to pass through the area. The NP skirted the problem by blasting out the solid rock 62-foot double-track short tunnel. Westbound, the NP continues on a long upgrade route ahead. The Milwaukee Road crests above the NP Short Tunnel and makes its way downgrade through Snake Canyon to the west. At the far end of the canyon, you can see the east switch for Milwaukee's Muscle Shell passing siding. The MNYP, on the other hand, faced the problem head-on. They blasted a total of 3 tunnels through that unforgiving rock face beyond Lilo Junction that required slide sheds for protection. All the sheds and tunnels here are of timber construction. We added this section of NP track to the layout because Bill wanted a section of straight track where he could stretch out and run a long string of cars. Here the NP blasted another rock ledge to allow trains to pass. Notice how the trees provide a view block, preventing the viewer from seeing the whole train at once. The town of Muscle Shell was the last town added to the layout. Muscle Shell is a mountain town served by all 4 of the layout's railroads. It contains about 18 linear feet of track. Passing over the Northern Pacific twin bridges, we enter Muscle Shell. NP Bridge number 1 is a 311-foot double-track steel truss and girder bridge. And Bridge number 2 is a 109-foot double-track steel truss bridge. Both were kit bash projects using Walthers and Atlas parts. Muscle Shell has lots of great craftsman structures as well. Like many of the areas on the layout, we purposely designed this town site with very little level ground, as would be typical for a Montana mountain town. The Weaver Building is the last building Bill wanted added to the layout. He had relatives named Weaver and wanted to include this building in their honor. There are too many scenes to show them all, but here are a few of my favorites. The stone building is getting a new roof courtesy of these blue-collar workers. The Campbell Wooden Church is carefully situated on the hill at the east end of town. Notice how we blended the paved and gravel roads. This 3-story apartment building is typical of what you would find on the wrong side of the tracks. The Milwaukee Depot is a 2-sided structure and was custom built to our specs, following the lines of a real Milwaukee Depot that existed in Wisconsin. It is made mostly out of styrene and is one of only a few completely scratch-built structures on the layout. The North Coast Limited makes its way around the tracks that sit above the town of Muscle Shell. Here we used another real rock to break up the scene. To give the impression that the scene continues beyond our 4 walls, we used several tricks. Andy Ostazeski painted 2 dynamic scenes in this location, a sunset and a thunderstorm. They were painted from actual Montana scenery photos. The backdrops were painted before the layout sections were installed. We had to plan for the proper layout height at all locations and to make sure the layout scenery, which was already created in most locations, matched the backdrop. It was quite an undertaking, but all the work paid off with the realistic backdrops that really add depth and extend every scene. We also used reduced depth structures along the backdrop and placed hidden buildings behind background trees. These tricks leave the viewer wondering what's over the hill. The town of Carrizo is below the NP track. To access the town, the locals used the gravel road from Muscle Shell. Carrizo is a rough-and-tumble mountain town perched on the edge of Carrizo Gorge. Times can be tough here, and the law of the West rules. This structure, the Idaho Midland Stores, was also scratch-built by Gene Hickey and sits across the track at the east end of town. Carrizo contains several buildings typical for a lawless railroad town, including several bars. Next to the tracks, a train has unloaded its cargo for the local merchants. Behind the town, there's a one-man mining operation complete with a small mine tunnel. I really like the scene way down below Carrizo, where a guy got his car stuck at the bottom of a steep trail and couldn't get it back up, so he left it there. It's been there a long time, so long that a tree is now growing through the trunk. In front of the town site is our Milwaukee Road signature bridge, bridge number 7. It's a freelanced bridge that was built into the scenery. At 657 scale feet, it just outdoes the NP High Bridge as the longest bridge on the layout by 7 scale feet. The steel trestle section was scratch-built to mate with a steel truss bridge that Bill bought at an estate sale. It was great fun building the bridge to the existing terrain. Above the town of Carrizo is the NP Summit. It's the top of the grade for the westbound NP trains and the end of double track. Lots of meets occur here, and the eastbound upgrade traffic normally has priority. Throughout the layout, we have used prototypically operating signals. They are run by current detection and semiconductor logic. We use repeater panels where needed so that operators can easily view the signal indication. Passing over the summit, our train begins its descent. Heading downgrade from the summit, westbound NP trains approach Carrizo Gorge. The name comes from a gorge of nearly the same name in remote south central California, along the old San Diego and Arizona Railroad route. Traversing the gorge is the NP High Bridge. It is 650 scale feet long with 5.5 arches and a cantilever girder section. It was kit bashed out of about 6 arch bridge kits. I can't help it, I love building bridges. The bottom of the gorge comes down within 24 inches from the floor. To get the right shape for the gorge and our other large mountains, we used chicken wire and then put metal screen on top of that. We then placed wet newspapers on top to visualize the shape and make sure it was just right before we added the hard shell. The gorge itself and the loop were from the inspiration of the Wizard of Monterey, John Allen. I had the great fortune of visiting John Allen's layout many decades ago, and the floor-to-ceiling scenery was beyond belief. We like to say that Bill's idea of building a railroad loop was the reason he built a new house with a bigger railroad room. Now that's model railroading. We had been to Tehachapi Loop in California, and Bill said on the spot, "We need a loop." So we tried to fit it into his existing railroad room with no luck. So he decided to build a new house. The grade settings were a real adventure in civil engineering. The John Allen Loop is built to a minimum of 36-inch radius and a gradually increasing grade to a maximum of 1.9%, and a train of about 40 cars will complete the circle. The gorge winds back around under the NP tracks, and in the upper gorge is NP Bridge number 5, a 107-foot curved 2-span deck girder bridge that spans the MNYP and the gorge. Our NP train completes the loop and rounds the corner into the Phantom Canyon area. The Phantom Canyon area is just west of Carrizo Gorge and is the location of NP Vortex and the town of Modlo. The branch to Vortex runs over the NP Vortex branch, bridge number 1. It's a 135-foot, mostly timber bridge over the NP John Allen Loop and the Sapphire Creek Wash. The Vortex Mine Complex is a large operation and even has a platform for the NP railcar service. The NP Railcar B3 is at the mine platform now. We use genuine Yogo sapphire ore in this area, and it came from the real Vortex sapphire mine in Montana owned by another friend of Bill's, and we hauled it back to Minnesota. The mine is kit-bashed. It's a pretty dilapidated structure. They used sheet metal to repair the broken wall boards. However, the sapphires are quite valuable. Beyond the mine is the NP Vortex Branch Tunnel number 1 that leads to Shopville. Shopville is an accessible staging yard located in the workshop, hence the name Shopville. Back on the main line, the NP heads over another 2-span curved girder bridge over the MNYP, the 127-foot NP Bridge number 4. Note how the bridge support spans the MNYP track, another example of scratch building. Just beyond the NP Bridge is MNYP Rock Tunnel number 7. Moving down to the lowest track level, the MNYP, we pass through Phantom Canyon on our way to Modlo. Here we added a telltale. It warns anyone on top of a rail car that a low clearance structure is ahead. Modlo is a very small community that developed along the MNYP main line at the far western end of Phantom Canyon. Beyond Modlo, the main lines pass into multi-level double-ended staging. We can stage up to 24 long 40-car trains. The staging bench work is hung along all of the four walls below the backdrop. Way in the back corner is the Romo mine. It was recently scratch-built by a modeler in our group, Ed Romo. He does fantastic detail and weathering work. With the Northern Pacific North Coast Limited train heading into staging, that completes our tour of the MNYP main lines. Our second tour takes us high up in the mountains to the MNYP Lilo branch line. The branch line starts in the Palisade area and travels eastward to Winstead, makes a westward turn, passes through Caiston, the display case, and travels back along the wall to Van Dyne, just above Eagle's Nest. Today we are following MNYP RSD 5 number 127 with a short train headed upgrade. Here in the Palisade area, the branch line diverges from the MNYP main line and our Lilo branch begins. It enters the vertical rock face through the easternmost slide shed. After passing through the first Lilo tunnel, we emerge below the Lombard mine. We're in more rugged country now. Our train passes over the Lilo Bridge number 1, a 66-foot steel deck truss bridge crossing over an area called Dry Wash. We built this area to look like a typical mountain wash. There is no water because it's only wet after a heavy rain. Continuing upgrade, we approach Eagle Nest and Lilo Bridge number 2. Bill and I decided to build the 177-foot Eagle Nest bridge and tunnel after seeing the real thing along the Milwaukee Road near Lombard, Montana. It crossed over 16-Mile Creek. The real Milwaukee Road used this scenic location for promotional photographs. Wayne Hines did the rock work, and of course I scratch-built the bridge. Our train departs the Eagle Nest area through tunnel number 2. Emerging from tunnel number 3, the Lilo branch line is directly above Commercial Street in West Canyon Springs. We are traveling across the Lilo Bridge number 3, a 495-foot steel viaduct, again scratch-built. This is the viaduct we built over the road in West Canyon Springs in order to save space for the town below. Coming out of tunnel number 5, we are now below Big Baldy Mountain. Behind our train is the scenic mountain with its large volcanic crater. Big Baldy Mountain is a local landmark with its huge crater both in Montana and here. Big Baldy is the source of the Judith Creek. The creek runs behind the tracks. We cross over the creek on the small trestle and pass behind the bluff. On the original layout, this portion of the branch line was narrow gauge. That's why there is serpentine trackage and sharp curves throughout the area. High above on the rock wall are Lilo Bridges 5, 6, and 7. The middle bridge, number 6, is an unusual S-curve bridge 105 feet over the Judith River. All are scratch-built for their mountainside locations and all are timber trestles. Above the tracks we find Yogotown. Yogotown is a played-out mining town and consists of an active farm site and the abandoned ghost town site. I do believe I saw a prospector up there. Yogotown has its own history and is now in its third home as part of Bill's layouts, and is decades old. Continuing into Jack's Canyon, we head into Winstead. Winstead is hemmed in by rock on all sides at this remote location. We used standard hardshell scenery along with an overcoat of concrete patch mix at this location and in many others throughout the layout. Winstead is the site of the junction of the Litvin Log Camp Spur off of the MNYP Lilo branch, Litvin Junction. Also visible is the Winstead Depot, which sits just outside of the Lilo Tunnel number 6. Plunging into the tunnel, we head into the upper operating level of Bill's display case, Caiston. Cased-in is where the branch line uses a grade within the display case in order to accommodate the varying elevations on the layout. This display case is located just outside the layout room. After leaving the display case, we pass behind Big Baldy Mountain and head toward Briggsdale. Briggsdale is another almost played-out mining town further west, situated along the Lilo Branch. It has a depot and is surrounded by shabby old mine structures. Way above the town of West Canyon Springs, in the upper distance, is Lilo Bridge number 8, a 103-foot steel truss that spans a location called Sand Coulee. Continuing our upgrade ascent, we reach Milltown. Milltown is the site of the Lilo Lumber Mill and the reason for the construction of the long and circuitous MNYP Lilo Branch. The line works up a long, steep gradient and passes through 7 tunnels and over 9 bridges to reach this mill. The mill receives logs from the camps further up the line, cuts logs into usable lumber, and in turn ships them to their retail facility in Upper Canyon Springs. The logs loaded on these rail cars are actual lumber. The branch continues over a 423-foot timber trestle, bridge number 10, through a small settlement called Van Dyne, and then to a hidden automatic reverse loop behind the Saddleback Mountains. And that's the end of our branch line tour. We built Bill's layout using a hard-shell scenery technique that I perfected over the years. Today I'm going to show you my technique for creating realistic landscapes from the ground up. Let's head to the workshop. I like to experiment with unusual scenic techniques and vary the scenery around the layout for geographical interest. Today we are working on a 1 by 3 foot diorama built out of 1/2 inch plywood, and I've already cut the fascia profile board and the backdrop panel and drawn the horizon line on the panel. Once their profile is determined, the first step is to add the screen. I use metal screen from a hardware store, and as you can see from a hardware store, it's way too smooth, so we need to crumple it just a bit. And we turn our diorama and staple the screen down to the horizon line. I like to use plenty of staples. Next, I fold the screen back along the horizon line. I want a nice crisp horizon line. Then I fold the screen back and add a coat of hot glue over the staples. I like to do everything in a heavy-duty fashion. I use a stick to fold the screen into the hot glue. Then I can turn the diorama over and fold the screen down behind, making sure we have some crumples in the screen. Fold the screen behind my sub-road bed and attach it to the back of the sub-road bed with hot glue. I'd use staples here too, but I can't quite get the stapler in there to do it, so I'm going to use hot glue. And hold the screen wire in place until the hot glue sets up. Next, I will use my sheet metal shears to cut a seam in the screen that will start to create our wash. I can hot glue the screen to my riser here. That will also become the backer for my bridge abutment. Now that the hot glue is set up against our abutment riser, I'm going to staple screen down here in the bottom of our wash, and this will create our wash area. And every time I put in a staple, I use hot glue. Next, I'll do the same thing in the foreground with another piece of screen attaching to our profile fascia board with staples and hot glue. We've completed our foreground scenery, and I've cut away the excess screen, and now I'm ready to stitch using my hot glue gun. When I refer to stitching, I mean the process by which I attach the pieces of screen wire together as if you were stitching with needle and thread. When doing this process, it doesn't have to look beautiful because it'll all be covered up with scenery anyway. I've got a little piece left over here that just happened to appear, and so I've cut a little patch of screen that I will fit in like so. And stitch that in using the same method. Now that the screen wire is complete, I'm going to add joint compound on the seams and edges to add structure for the plaster work to come. We're done with the hot glue gun for now. The next step is to apply the joint compound. I use an artist's palette knife to do this. Another benefit of using joint compound as compared to modeling plaster is that the joint compound has a long set time and gives you plenty of time to work with it. I'm using this joint compound here to take out any funny looking creases in the screen wire, and also to add strength for the upcoming layers of plaster. And I periodically clean off my palette knife with a damp cloth. I allow the joint compound to dry overnight. The joint compound adds a lot of structure to the screen. I'm using a little extra joint compound in this area because there was a little bump in the screen and it didn't look geologically correct. So I'm trying to take that funny bump out with joint compound. Along the front edge, I use it sparingly. It doesn't have to completely cover up the screen. We're using the screen as basically as a reinforcing bar, and the main thing is to get the plaster into the screen. It doesn't have to cover it. With the joint compound complete, we'll let our module dry overnight before we add another layer of plaster. The next procedure is putting a plaster base coat on top of the screen, and I use kind of a unique mixture for that too. I like unique things. So what I do is I use a mixture of joint compound, white glue, sifted sand, and a few drops of liquid soap to create wetted water, break down the surface tension, along with just plain water that I use to thin the mixture out. Now I mix this up to a consistency that's thick but brushable, and I just mix the quantities by eye. I don't have any kind of a recipe for this. So I brush it on like so, and the reason I like this is that it's actually brushed into the screen. It actually uses the strength as the screen as a reinforcing bar, and the sand actually helps give the texture on our base coat. Also, another advantage of doing this is that it has a long drying time, so it gives us plenty of time to get the shape exactly the way we want it. I just keep brushing until all the holes in the screen are filled. This base coat layer doesn't take a long time. It basically adds strength and texture to the scenery. This will be just as strong as hydrocal when it's finished. And I wouldn't use this on a large area, but I think for a small area it's very beneficial. I think the scenic benefits outweigh the hydrocal in this particular case. I use the same technique to cover the entire diorama and let it dry again, normally overnight, before I put on the next layer. To add strength to our scenery, we need 2 coats of plaster, and so we've applied our base coat, and now we're ready to do our top coat. And the top coat is basically the same formula, although I substitute concrete patch compound for the joint compound. That gives a nice color and top coat texture to the finished product. Once the top coat is dry, all it needs to be done is to clean up areas that may have gotten spilled plaster. And so I use a small sanding block to clean up the front edge of the fascia contour board that will accept a finished fascia, and also the roadbed if there's excess plaster there. When the plaster layer is dry and complete, the next layer we add would be the base foliage level. And that's done with a mixture that I use here, another unique mixture. This is a combination of many things. It's ground foam, static grass, sifted pencil sharpener shavings, real dirt and sifted sand. And I will paint that down with my thinned out white glue mix using wetted water and white glue. And I brush that down onto the area, get good coverage because we want this stuff to stick well. This is going right on top of our concrete mix. And in areas where grass would not normally grow in a more vertical area, the concrete mix will show through, and you'll see the texture of the concrete mix. And so by dropping the foliage mix on here, we're going to get a heavier coat on the more level areas and a lighter coat on the more vertical areas. That'll give you a much more natural ground cover. I love the texture of this stuff, and Most of this will be covered up with your top grass layer, but what does show through then will give you a real nice texture. Now we can see what our base foliage layer looks like when the glue is dry. The next operation would be to put the appropriate top foliage layer on, depending on your geographical location. I like to use a dull color on the base foliage to give it depth in the scene. I use this type of material for the top foliage layer. This is static grass, which is this material, and netted ground foam foliage material, which is this material. If you want to do something interesting, you can take an inexpensive pine tree such as this, spray it with spray glue, and actually sprinkle the foliage material right onto the tree. And you'll get a finished product that looks more like this, which is much more interesting because it's multicolor and has depth that the other tree doesn't have. Now we're going to do an example of the foliage top coat using my thinned out white glue mixture. We'll add a little bit of white glue right in this area. And then we'll take some of our foam and put it in, and I like to pat it down to make sure it's down there good. A mixture of both the foliage and the static grass. And this process doesn't have to be done all at one time. If there's a little spot that you think you missed and want to add more foliage later, or maybe even a slightly different color foliage, you can always come back with your bottle of white glue and add a drop of white glue in that spot, and then fill in with a small piece of foliage. Now we can easily install a tree in this location. I use a small awl, and we can poke right through the scenery layer, make a hole, and attach a tree thusly. I use white glue. If you're in a hurry, you can use hot glue for this process. Here we can see trees installed along with the top coat of foliage. I've used bigger trees in the foreground to act as a view block, and also smaller trees in the background to force the perspective. I love the texture here, and I think using this process you can get a wonderful model railroad scene. Another way to add realism to your model railroad is with bridges. On a real railroad, bridges follow the natural slopes and curves of the landscape. However, on many layouts, modelers make the landscape fit the bridge. Let's look at a more realistic way to add a bridge to the scene by modifying the bridge structure to fit an existing scene. For this bridge installation, I'm using a long piece of sub-road bed that'll actually span where the bridge is going to go to retain continuity of the grade. I've put in risers on both ends that are actually set to meet the end of the bridge. The risers will then be used as the backer for the bridge abutments as they go into the layout. At this point now, I've drawn my lines on the sub-road bed, and I can cut that bridge section out using my saber saw. Now we've cut the openings for the installation of the bridge, and I've installed this profile board that will actually be the support for the steel bent in the bridge. I've centered it between the bridge openings. The screen wire will come down to the low level here and come up this way and be stapled down to here along with the hot glue, so that we have a firm support for the bridge work. I really enjoy scratch building bridges, and the fun thing for me is to build a bridge into an existing contour of scenery, as of course a real railroad bridge would be built. I've decided I was going to build a two-span deck girder bridge using a center steel bent. And this is an example of the type of bent that I started out with, and as you can see, it's much taller than the bottom of the opening. I built this two-span deck girder bridge using parts from my junk box. It has Atlas girders, plastic deck from an unknown source, and a steel bent that comes from a Plasticville O-gauge signal bridge kit. I've extended the rails beyond the end of the bridge to ensure that we don't have any sort of a bump. Now, the legs on this bent are just a slight bit long, so I'll use my nipper to trim them off just a bit. So that the bridge fits perfectly. From this point on, many super details can be applied. Detailed bridge abutments, bridge shoes, guardrail across the bridge, a handrail across the walkway, and many more shrubs and trees, rock outcroppings, and finally ballasted roadbed. With a little bit of thought and effort, you too can build a realistic bridge scene into your layout. I've enjoyed building this layout over the past 20 years and made some great friends along the way. This layout is still not done, but like I said before, a layout is never done. We have progressed a lot in the 8 years this layout has been in its current home, but there always will be unfinished projects. I hope you have enjoyed your tour of the MNYP.
Thank you for watching this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series. Look for future Great American Layout editions as together we explore more of America's greatest model railroads.
My name is Doug Hodgdon, and I'm here with Bill Brigg, the founder and inspiration behind the Muscle Shell and Yogo Peak Railroad, which is now in its third location. And we wanted to talk about how Bill got interested in model railroading to begin with, starting with his childhood in St. Paul.
Well, to make things easy and short, my wife and I had a Swedish boy over here from Sweden for a year's study. And he said to me one night, "Why don't we build a model railroad?" And I said, "Okay, let's try it." Well, neither one of us had any idea what to do. We were novices. So I had a bench made, and we started in and bought some equipment. We bought transformers and things to run the trains with. And suddenly it was time for him to go back to Sweden. And he left me with the railroad. Wasn't too pleasant. This was in 1973. So I was fooling around with it, trying to figure out what to do. Wound up at a hobby shop down on Lake Street called Woodcraft Hobby. It's closed now. And I tried to buy the equipment that I needed. Looked like this was going to be futile. And luck of all lucks, I ran into a young guy down there working by the name of Doug Hodgdon. And that was the beginning of it. So he and I tagged up. He came out to my house. He was, I think, aghast at what I had done. He knew it was all the wrong way. So I took on with Doug, and in 1983, I moved the railroad to a new house, which Judy and I had built. Not this one, the one before this one. And we built this house with a little bigger train room, so we could accomplish something. Well, we did. We tore the other one, what there was of it, apart, and we moved out to here, about 3 blocks from here. Built a house in Amesbury, and the railroad got moved, of course, and it got bigger. Don't they all? So we moved in there, worked with it there till 1985, and that's when we moved again. We built another house, this house, and we started working on a new one. That's the one that you see here. That was 7 years ago. And we started putting her back in shape. The move was terrible. It was awful. I'll never do it again. But I won't live that long anyway. But we put the layout in this room, put what we had back together, increased the space from 900 square feet to 1,500 square feet. And that was enough to keep us busy for a long, long time. This is now called the Muscle Shop. And you'll go peek. It isn't finished. It never will be. It looks like it is, but we'll never get it finished. And this guy, Doug, is not only be transferred to one of my very best friends, but we have traveled a lot together all over the United States, taking pictures. I don't know how many slides I have taken, but it's helped us build the railroad. And without him, this wouldn't be here. And I hope you'll appreciate what you're seeing, because it's really, if I say so or not, outstanding. And that's it, Doug. It's up to you.
Thank you, fella.